Music notation has been around for thousands of years. Through it, we're able to record in written form the music we play and share those ideas with other musicians so they can play it too. Most people are familiar with the look of traditional Western music notation, which began in the 14th century and became established by the end of the 17th century. In the Western pop music era, where folk and blues-based music has dominated, chord charts with letters or numbers gained popularity. And so probably, if you're involved with church music, contemporary church music, you'd be used to seeing it presented in this way, a line of lyrics with single letters or numbers above. Using the chord chart is easy. You look at the chart to see which chord is indicated, find the correlating chord shape on your instrument, play the chord, and repeat the process for the next chord until the song is done. But to understand the chord chart, we're going to need to look at a little bit of simple music theory. Now, you may recognize that sound as what we call in traditional Western music theory a C major scale. And that was 2 octaves of the C major scale. And you'll see that I've labeled the notes of the 2nd octave with numbers beyond 8 because we sometimes use numbers in some of our chord symbols beyond 8. Each note of the scale correlates to a number, and a chord built on that note will take the same number. So whether the chord created is major or minor depends on the notes that are available to us in the scale. On the piano, C major is the easiest to work with from a visual point of view because it includes all the ivory notes and none of the ebony notes. But actually, all major scales behave in exactly the same way. So what I'm about to show you using the C major scale will be true in any major scale. To create a chord starting on C in the key of C, we add the 3rd above and another 3rd above. A chord starting on C in the key of C is a C major chord. It's called a major triad sometimes as well because it's composed of 3 notes. A chord starting on D using only the notes available in the C major scale, so we've got a D there, if we put a 3rd above and a 3rd above, would give us a minor chord. That would be a D, F, A. And hopefully you can hear the difference between that minor chord and the major chord. A major chord, particularly a C major chord, has a confident, happy sound, and the D minor chord has a sadder tone to it. As we go up the scale, forming chords on each note, using only the notes available in the scale, then we'll find that each of the chords has a different tonality, either major or minor. So the C major is a major. The chord of the D is a minor chord. The chord on E is a minor chord too. The chord on F is a major chord. The chord on G is a major chord. The chord on A is a minor chord, and then, well, there's this chord that we could build on B. But if we're only using the notes in the scale of C, it doesn't sound like a major or a minor. And in fact, it's a B diminished chord, and that's why that doesn't get used much. So how does all this translate to the chord sheets? Well, each of these chords can be represented on a chord sheet in a simple notation. If I want the band to play the chord of C major, then I simply write a C. When we see a capital letter like this on its own, it represents the major chord. So a G would mean G major. F would mean F major. This notation doesn't indicate the exact arrangement of the 3 notes making the chord, so I could put the C at the bottom, or E at the bottom, or G at the bottom. And it would still be a C chord. I'm using the 3 notes that make up the C triad, and each of those is a C chord. Similarly on guitar, I could play a C in different positions, maybe in a 1st position, or here in a 2nd position, or here in a 3rd position. All of those are C major chords. So there's a certain amount of freedom of interpretation implicit in this kind of musical notation. Also, it's important to realise there's no international standard for how these kind of chord sheets are written or interpreted, so the following may need some adjustments depending on your playing environment. Let's look at some of the different chord symbols. As we've said, C major only uses the ivory notes, but if you were playing in a different key, these symbols might need to include sharps or flats, which is the ebony notes on a piano. If we were in E flat, for example, then the first chord of that scale would be E flat. And we would represent that simply by placing a flat symbol behind the letter E. And that gives us E flat. In that key, A flat would be a major chord, and so would B flat. And these would all be shown with a capital letter with a B symbol behind it, which is just the lowercase b, and that doubles as our flat. In the same way, if you were in a sharp key, you would present the chord with a sharp symbol behind the capital letter, which is a hashtag symbol. And so for an example there, F sharp, if you were to play the chord of F sharp, it's a capital letter F with a sharp symbol after it, and that's the major chords. For minor chords, we simply put a lowercase m after them. So in the scale of C major, if we were going to go with that second chord, the D minor, then the way we write that is we have a capital letter D with a small m after it. E minor is big E with an M after it. A minor, same. Each of these is shown as a capital letter with a small m after it. And so we have our major and minor chords, and we have our chords with sharps and flats. Now, what else might we encounter on a church chord sheet? Well, we might find added numbers, chords with numbers added after the chord. So if we look back at our scale, we had 2 octaves of scale. The first has the numbers from 1 to 8, and then the numbers carry on past the octave. And as I said, sometimes we're going to use those higher numbers. Each time you see a number after the chord, it simply means the note with that number has been added to the chord. So let's use a simple example to begin with. If we take our basic C chord, and now we see it written as C with a 2 afterwards, that's the 2 is D. It simply means the second degree of the scale has been added to the chord. And this is shown as C2, or sometimes as C add 2. There's several other numbers that I might add. It might be a 4. So that would be an added 4, or it might be that we add a 6. Sometimes we add the 7, but I'll talk about that in a separate moment. And then there's sus chords. Sometimes when you see a 2 or a 4, you'll also see the word sus in that chord. The sus means we've suspended the third and replaced it with either the 2 or the 4. So in our C2 chord, we had the third and the second, but now we've got the second replacing. So it's not the same as when you have the adding a 2. You're now replacing the 3 with the 2, or you might be replacing the 3 with the 4. And so a sus chord only has the 3 notes in it. Same sus2 or sus4. Another chord that takes away the third is the no third chord. So you might see it written as C no third. This is a very simple chord to play because it literally is just 2 notes. It contains only the root note, the number 1 note, and the 5th of the scale. And this is very useful when a songwriter doesn't want the music to commit to being either a major or a minor, because it's actually the third in the chord that defines whether the chord is major or minor. And so sometimes that no third chord can be very useful in that situation. So I said there's also the number 7 that we might add to a chord, and the reason I'm going to treat this separately is because there's 2 different versions of the 7 chord. When we add the 7, there's 2 different ones. One sounds quite bluesy and the other is more jazzy. That's how I'd describe it. If I use the 7th from the major scale, so that's the 7th, we get the jazzy sounding 7 chord. And this is usually shown with the word major, abbreviated to maj, and then 7. So it's the major 7, because it's the 7 from the major chord. And so you'd have a maj 7 written after the capital letter of the chord. The other 7 uses the flattened 7, which is borrowed from outside the scale. It's actually from the minor scale. And so this is also known as a minor 7. And that you'll hear is more like the blues 7 that you'd be used to hearing in blues music. And that would just be represented by a 7 after the capital letter, because that's the more common variant of the chord. Now, what if I want to add a 7 to a minor chord? Well, usually in church music, we'd be adding a flattened 7 to a minor chord. And so that would be the sound there. And that would just be represented with the capital letter C, small m for the minor chord, and then a 7, because that's the typical 7 to have in that. Beyond the 7th, well, what if I want to add more notes to a 7 chord? Well, like I said, chords are usually grown by adding the 3rd above. And so once you go past the 7, you'd actually be adding outside of the octave. We could add the 2nd degree of the scale, but because we already have a 7, we don't call it the 2nd. Instead, we call it the 9th. It's the same note, but it's at the top of the chord. And so that is now a 9th. Because it's got that 9 at the top. The 7th isn't written down at this point because the 9 is written, and so therefore the 7 is assumed, but it is present. And the same, similarly, we could write an 11, and that would now include the 7 and the 9 and the 11. And now we get into some very sort of discordant, kind of different sounding chords, but they can also find their place depending how you voice them. Sometimes some of these chords we write them in totally different ways. So for example, this C11, we might write that in a different way as like a G minor over C or something like that, but we'll talk about those chords a little further down. The last 2 chord variants to think about are the diminished and the augmented chord. A diminished chord is based on a minor chord, but it also lowers the 5th. And so that's the sound of a diminished chord. And we would simply write that as C dim. For an augmented chord, we take the major chord and we've now raised the 5th. And you might recognize that sound. It's a sound that pushes you forward. It's telling you we're going somewhere. And so that we would just write as a C aug. These aren't common chords in like regular Western church music, but they do crop up every now and again. And so it's good to know that they exist. Now, I mentioned about writing chords in a different way with a slash chord. And this is where we play a chord of C, for example, but we don't want the bass note to be C. And this is called an inversion. Remember how I said we could make the chord out of the 3 basic notes, the 1, the 3, and the 5? Well, if I play it that way, that's called the first position because it's got the 1 at the bottom. If I invert the chord, taking the lowest note and placing it at the top, well, now that is going to be called the second position. If I do that again, leaving the 5th at the bottom and taking the 3rd and putting that at the top, now it's called the 3rd position. Now, if I'm playing a chord of the 7, I could even have a 4th position, where the 7th is at the bottom of that chord. Most commonly in church music, those inversions are including a bass note. I may even play the same chord with my right hand, but the inversion would be sounded in the bass note that I'm playing with my left hand. On a chord sheet, the way we represent these inversions is with a slash chord, a slash that way. C over E means that the chord is C, but the bass note is E. And you might recognize that it's quite a triumphant sort of rising up sound. It's great for building music. If we had a C/G, that would mean that the chord is C, but the bass note is G. And that kind of leaves us hanging. It kind of has this suspended kind of feel to it, where we're just kind of hanging in space for a moment. If you had a C/B, this would mean that the chord is C major 7, but the bass note is B. And that would be the C major 7 in the 4th position. Likewise, you could have a C over B flat that would be a C7 in the 4th position. Slash chords or inverted chords can be very effective in added interest and emotion to your music. So if you're playing in the spirit, for example, moving between C over E and F, or C over E and F over A, it sounds much more interesting than if you're just moving between C and F. That's C and F. Now if I add those inversions, it has a much richer sound to it. And so it's nice to know how to do that so you can add some much more interest, particularly in those times of spontaneous or singing in the spirit and that kind of thing. Remember, the letter in front of the slash indicates the main chord, and the letter after the slash shows the bass note, and so indicates which inversion or position the chord should be played in. A bass player and the left hand of the piano player should always play the note following the slash. On guitar, it's a little bit less important to try and play the slash chords, but if you do, the chord above the line or before the line is the higher notes that you'd be voicing, and the letter after the line are the lower notes that you'd be voicing. And that's all of the chords that you are likely to encounter. So get familiar with those chords, understand how to read them, and then you'll be on your way to playing church music.